want to talk to you about telling stories. And I work in my spare time at Two Lives Left. So over the past few projects that we've created, I've come to learn the importance of telling stories. And I'm hoping to convince you today that thinking about your creations as stories, and perhaps even deciding what to create by considering the story first, is a good way and a powerful way to bring something to market. So what do I mean by a story? Well, obviously not this. I mean an idea that you want people to spread about your product. And a good story has the ability to spread. People will want to share it, they'll find it interesting, it'll become part of their daily conversation, and it resonates with people. And sometimes stories happen by accident. You might not even know that you have a good story until you bring your product to market and the story takes hold. That happened to us with Codea, which I'll get into shortly. And you can learn to tell these stories on purpose. So over time, you become more adept at telling stories and seeing the potential for them in the things that you create. So to start, I want to tell you about the first two games we released on the App Store. And these games didn't do terribly well. So we think that's because we didn't have a story to tell with these games. These games were Wheeler's Treasure, which to date has earned a little bit over $6,000, and Pilot Wins, which made about $18,000. Now, we worked really hard building these games, and they were good games. They got great reviews. We launched them and tweeted about them, and even bought some advertising, which did nothing. And they didn't do very well. They didn't cover their costs. So what was missing? Well, actually first, the reason that they didn't do that is because there was no reason to talk about them. We naively thought that having a unique game mechanic and a reasonably polished game was enough to get noticed. It wasn't, and it was entirely our fault. We didn't give our players a reason to talk about our games. Our games were just additional icons in a sea of apps on the App Store for players to choose from. So what was missing? Well, our players firstly didn't know who we were. We were just a company. But we were actually an indie developer, and we didn't market ourselves as an indie developer. We were trying to aim for mass market success when we should have targeted a smaller, more passionate audience and attempt to build a following. So in short, no one cared about our games but us. And why should they? We were basically begging for attention, trying to stand out by brute force without capturing the imagination of the audience. So next I want to talk about an app we released called Codea, and it kind of became an accidental story. It's a popular programming app for iPad that we released in 2011. And I want to tell you Codea's story because it's a story I didn't really realize it had until recently. So firstly, Codea was born out of an argument that I had with a friend. We were arguing about game mechanics, and I wanted to test an idea to prove a point. But I didn't have my laptop, I only had my iPad. So I couldn't write a game and test it. I couldn't write code and run it and see the visuals. So I was frustrated at that because the iPad was a pretty powerful computer. Even the iPad 1, it was more than enough for what I wanted to do. So when I got home that evening, I started designing the first version of Codea based on my favorite desktop programming tools. And I didn't even expect Apple to approve it. I just wanted it on my iPad for myself so I could use it. But I submitted version 1.0 to the App Store anyway, just to see if it would get through. It wasn't in a state fit for public release. But after a very long time and some weird questions, Apple approved it. So I worked on an update that added actual documentation and made it fit for public release. And the current version is a lot nicer than the original version 1.0. So Codea's story was simple. It was, you can make games on your iPad. And I didn't realize it at the time, but there happened to be a lot of people who wanted what I wanted. And Codea was a success because it tapped into a very passionate and very dedicated niche of users. And these users spread the story of Codea, that you could make games on your iPad, and the app became successful. So next, we released a game called Cargo Bot, and it's a puzzle game we released in 2012. So when we came up with this game, we built it with the intent to tell a story. So soon after we released Codea, I was asked by a lot of people to set up a forum for the app where people could share code and ideas. So I set one up and it became quite popular. Eventually, a user named Hui started contributing some really amazing work. He started out by building fairly exact replicas of his favorite games using Codea. So stuff like Enduro and Pac-Man. So here's his first version of Enduro. And at the time, Codea was pretty primitive. He'd built these using like really basic primitives in the app. It's a lot more sophisticated now. So he'd done a lot of hard work. And then he came up with this game. So this was his post on the forums where he shared a game called Robo-Arm. And it was based on one of his favorite programming games. At the time, it didn't look like very much. It looked like this. So this was the first prototype I downloaded from the forums and ran on my iPad. And you had to sort of tap instructions and tap where you wanted them to go. And his game instructions were written to the console. But I found that I spent over an hour playing it, and it was really fun. So I found the story that I wanted to share. I wanted to release the first game programmed on an iPad. And I wanted Robo-Arm to be the basis for that game. I thought it would be a great way for people to find out about Codea, because here was an amazing prototype, and it was a game about programming, so it seemed like a really good fit. So I got in touch with Hui and asked if he would be willing to work with me to release his game on the App Store as the first game programmed on an iPad. And he was delighted with the idea. He worked in the finance industry in New York, and he coded games in his spare time. So we decided that I would do the art and design, and Hui would program the game on his iPad. So I sent over some initial sketches of how I thought the game should look. I moved it into portrait mode because that, to me, felt more suitable to puzzle games. It feels like a book to me. And I thought it should be colourful. I insisted we have drag and drop. And we went with a sort of a colourful nautical theme. So we renamed the game Cargo Bot from Robo-Arm. And we had it to be about like stacking shipping containers with crates. And after a few months of back and forth with design and programming, we finally finished the game. And we found another user on the Codea forums to compose the music using Codea. It was interesting. So on a short aside, the user, Fred, who composed the music, at the time, Codea didn't support explicit music playback. It only had a random sound effects generator. So you could only put in random numbers and get random sounds. So the way he composed the music was that he tuned Codea's random sound effects generator by putting in heaps of random numbers and mapping the results to the right notes. And then he had built a way to play instruments using Codea. It was a really amazing accomplishment. So the final game looked much nicer than the original prototype, and we decided to release it for free. It was Hui's game, and he was the creator, but it was also a way to advertise Codea. That's what the story was for. So we included a big "How was this game created" button on the main screen, and it had a Made with Codea logo. And pressing that button took you to a page that explained the story. It said, this game was programmed on an iPad, and you can download Codea and make your own games here. So that was the story we wanted to share. And the response to that story was amazing. So I tweeted about the game at 3 a.m. and immediately was flooded with emails. I was just getting them every few seconds. And 10 minutes later, someone called for a Skype interview. So I just didn't get any sleep that night. But it showed that the story of CargoBot captured people's imaginations. And it spread very quickly because of that. it was also kind of a meta story, which some news sites picked up on, in that it was the first game programmed on an iPad, and it was a game about programming that could be used to teach programming. And it happened to be a really good game on top of that, with fun, challenging puzzles. But as an advertisement, how did it go? So you can kind of make out that line there. That was Codea's daily sales before we released CargoBot. And then we released it. And on the second day after release, we saw a 40 times increase in revenue. So I don't think we could have come up with a better way to advertise Codea than the story we ended up with. And it also sort of increased the base level after that, as someone's previously mentioned. So that brings me to the latest game we released, which was Crabitron. So 2 years ago, my friend John came up with an idea for an iPad game where you command a giant space crab. Here's the slide you saw earlier. So you would do this by using your 4 fingers to control its 2 claws, kind of like this. So after a lot of arguing about whether the idea was a good one, we prototyped it, we found it fun, and we called it Crabitron. And we went ahead and decided to make the game. That was back in 2011. So now we're in 2013, and John and I have spent a significant amount of our spare time over the last 2 years dedicated to making this game. So by comparison, here's where the entire development and release of Codea happened on this timeline. So after spending this long on the game, something happened. We finished it. And it was slightly unexpected because we had spent so long building it. So now we didn't really know what to do. We had to release it, but we didn't want people to see it as just another game. We wanted to see whether it would be a success or failure. So before the release, John and I were talking and we figured out a release date. We decided to launch it on a Friday. And the weekend before, we were discussing what the hell we needed to do to get people to play our game. We were going through the normal steps, like figuring out a price, drafting emails to review sites, writing a press release, publishing the trailer. But we were missing the story again. And again, not this story. So Crabitron itself had a pretty neat gameplay hook, we thought, that we, as far as we were aware, hadn't been done before. But we didn't have a way for our audience to really connect with us. So the moment I stepped away from writing press emails, I realized that the story we needed was this. It was a Kickstarter parody called Crabstarter. And the hook was that it was a reverse Kickstarter. And by reverse Kickstarter, it meant that the product was already made. And we set our funding goal at $100,000. So our goal was, that was a rough estimate of the cost of the development of the game. So this story had 3 goals. It was to allow people to become invested in our success or failure. And in order to do this, we looked to Kickstarter again. And one of the great things about Kickstarter is that when you back a project, you want to see it succeed. You see the numbers go up. You want to see them reach their goals. We wanted people to feel that way about our game. But because it was already funded, what we chose to do was to publish live sales data that updated dynamically on our site every day. So we just made our sales public completely. And anyone can check in and see how we're doing at any time. The other goal we had was to convince our players that we are human. And what I mean by this is we wanted our players to identify with us as indie developers. So we filmed a Kickstarter-like video of us talking to the camera. It was just sort of me and John sitting in front of the camera trying to explain our game, what the Crabstarter was about, and why you should back our project. This was actually pretty hard to do. I think we had to do about 30 takes to get a 1-minute introduction right. So I was going to show you the clips that we didn't use. Okay, screw that up.
Alright, do you want to start again?
Yeah. See where Crabbatron is in the chart.
Become our goal for this kicks. Crab starter!
Well, thanks for watching. It sounded sarcastic.
Thanks for watching, you jerks. And the last part of the site was to just be funny. The story had to not take itself too seriously. Because we were billing ourselves as a reverse Kickstarter, we thought we were basically telling people that we're selling you a game like normal. There wasn't anything special about it, but we acknowledged that on the site. We thought that would help our story achieve its goals if we didn't take ourselves too seriously. And so the final site ended up looking like this, which looks a lot like Kickstarter, except the Back This Project button simply took you to the App Store. And the reaction to the story was great. The story caught on. And this was interesting because the story caught on in a way that brought about exactly the reaction we were hoping for. A lot of people who saw the story shared it and also shared their feelings that they wanted us to succeed. And they identified with us. So I think it's summed up really well in this tweet by Eli Hodap, the chief editor of Touch Arcade, who basically just called everyone jerks and told them to buy our game. But the idea was that he wanted to see us succeed. And it was great that our story got the message across and got shared with people. Another really interesting reaction to our story happened on the Something Awful forums. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Something Awful forums, but if you're not, it's a web forum full of very rude people who each can have an avatar image next to their name and a custom title. What's interesting is that you can pay $5 to change your image under your name on the forum. And what's more interesting is that you can pay $10 to change someone else's avatar. So we saw a lot of traffic coming to our site from Something Awful. And we looked at their iOS gaming thread and found this. So some amazing person had gone and purchased Crabbatron avatars for a whole bunch of other forum members, something like 20 or 30 other people. And the text underneath each avatar was a link to the App Store. And we had nothing to do with it. We still have no idea who did this. And it was a really funny and bizarre discovery for us. And I think it had a lot to do with our story. Some of the interesting quotes from Something Awful. Fuck whoever is buying all these crab avatars. Who is buying all these things? Something Awful has now made more money off Crabbatron than the developer.
So, while the story caught on, the game didn't sell that well. And that got me into thinking about why it didn't sell that well. Because I thought it was a really good story. And it seemed to get a really great reaction. So I believe a serious mistake you made with this particular story was that people who purchased Crabbatron from the App Store without ever seeing our story didn't see it. Because unlike CargoBot, there was no link from Crabbatron back to the Crabstarter story. There was no direct connection from our game to the story. So I think we got a small dedicated following from our story, but we didn't get anything from the reverse, from the customers who found us purely through the App Store. So to finish, in Codea, the app was the story. People who purchased it intuitively understood and shared it with others. In CargoBot, we had a direct link on the main screen to tell people how the game is made, showing them why it was special, and telling them that they too could build their own game. And in Crabbatron, we had nothing to link back to our story. No way for people who purchased our game to identify with us, see how well the game is doing, or feel encouraged to share it. So we made the same mistake that we made with our first two games. So stories are important because they give people something to share, a way to capture their imagination, and a way to resonate with them. I hope I've encouraged you to consider a story for your next release, whether it's a game, an app, or something else. Thank you.